Listeners, you've heard us talk along these lines before. Women have remained some of the most marginalized members of the bleeding disorders community, despite reporting similar symptoms to their male counterparts. However, meaningful change is on the horizon, and projects like SHEmophilia, presented by the Chess Foundation, aim to ensure that the voices of women and girls are consistently heard to create substantive change in diagnosis, treatment, and care. In this next segment, we'll be hearing from a woman named Shelley who talks about her life before she was diagnosed with a bleeding disorder. Let's take a listen.
Well, growing up, I used to always have to go to the emergency room. Weekly, my parents would take me at least 2 or 3 times a week, and they would have to cauterize my nose because it would bleed so much. And I remember that they would take this cloth and put it in boiling hot water, and then they would shove it up my nose to stop the bleeding. And after a while, it just became regular. And it's interesting because, you don't really think anything's wrong with you because they don't ask you questions, they don't diagnose you, you just keep going back, and they keep repeating the same thing to make the bleeding stop. And like I said, after Matthew was born, then I realized, wait a second, when I had him, I had a C-section. And they couldn't stop me from bleeding. They literally had to turn me upside down to keep the blood inside of me until they could figure out what to give me to stop my bleeding. And at that point, when Matthew was then diagnosed with hemophilia, I thought to myself, you know what? I bet you that I have hemophilia. This all makes sense now. All the bleeding that I had, all the bruising. When the boys, I have 2 sons, and when they were growing up, they were very active in sports. If I had my period during a time that they had a game, I couldn't even go to their games because I would be afraid that I would have an accident and I'd have to come home and change.
What happened when you first visited a healthcare professional?
Well, the interesting thing is that I went to a treatment center in the state that I live in California. I went with a friend of mine, and I had been diagnosed by my son's hematologist prior to this visit. And that hematologist happened to retire from the hospital. So I went back in for an annual visit. And when I went in, they actually looked at me and said to me, we're sorry, but, you don't have a bleeding disorder. And I'm like, wait a second, I was diagnosed with a bleeding disorder. And they were like, well, that doctor no longer works here, and we have to go off what our results show. And our results show that you don't have a bleeding disorder. So after that, I advocated for myself, and through different resources and groups that I belong to, I heard that there was a doctor in the state of Nevada that treated women with bleeding disorders. So I made an appointment, went up for a visit, and got my diagnosis up there.
All right, and there you have Shelley, at least a portion of her story from Chess's SHEmophilia project. Amy and I just listened to that segment for the first time ourselves. Amy, what's your first reaction?
Well, I'm just so pleased that these stories are being told because, unfortunately, I just don't think, this just feels like a very common story in our community, and not to dismiss it, but just to, realize that this is a, systemic thing that, women have just assumed that this is normal for years and years and years. I think it's changing the way that we view women and our symptoms and what the treatment should be. It's being able to trust our medical professionals, to find a medical professional that will listen to us and take us seriously. That is something that is extremely difficult and sometimes takes multiple steps, and it's difficult. I think there's also like a feeling of relief, understanding like, oh, this is why this is why this makes sense. But there is just that maze of the healthcare system, to just navigate through. Anyway, I just listening to her, it was like, yes.
I found myself very quickly frustrated because, as you said, Amy, we hear stories like this all the time.
All the time.
And to not hear them or to hide from them or to get sick of them, and I say that respectfully, just like to be like, oh my God, still, like, why? But it doesn't mean they're not true. It doesn't mean it's not happening. This is a systemic, historical problem. And unfortunately, like someone going to the ER 2-3 times a week to have their nose cauterized. Are you kidding? I think the part of Shelley's short story there in particular, though, that gets under my skin is a lack of curiosity on the medical providers to, this kid's coming in 2-3 times a week to have their nose cauterized.
Yeah.
No one's curious about this.
Yeah.
No one's investigating beyond the symptom and the crisis of the moment.
Because she's a girl.
How many times have you heard a story of a boy with hemophilia needing his nose cauterized for weeks, 2-3 times a day, weeks, months, years, and it takes 27 years for that boy to be diagnosed? Not to say it doesn't happen, but it does not happen nearly at the same frequency. So we have to drill into the minds of hematologists and primary healthcare providers and dentists and gynecologists that women have bleeding disorders and that they are largely undiagnosed. So I'm glad, to your point, Amy, bringing it to a productive place, that Chess, amongst other organizations, we talked with Ashley Gregory not too long ago about FAIR, this new initiative for women as well. Like, we need all of this. Chess.education is where you can go, listeners, if you want to learn more to support Chess's program for women with bleeding disorders, if you want to look into or attend a Chess event for individuals and families in the inhibitor community, you can simply get in touch with them via chess.education. So www.ches, just one S in chess, CHES.education for more. And thank you to the leadership at Chess for sharing that audio with us.
Yes.
And thank you, Shelley, and to all the women who shared as part of their program for putting your stories out there so that hopefully more women do the same and more providers start to recognize, wow, there's something here that we have to address.
Absolutely. Absolutely.